Hello everyone. My name is John Sierra and I'm a Tolkien scholar. And what that essentially means is that I have read and studied the works of J.R.R. Tolkien extensively for a very long time, since I was a young boy, in fact. And I'm generally speaking the kind of guy that you can come to ask any sort of Tolkien question, whether it's about The Hobbit or The Lord of the Rings or the Silmarillion or really any of the satellite stories or his translations or anything else that you can think of. If you have a question, you can leave one right in the comment section, and I'll get back to you when I can. But if you want an in-depth answer and you want to be featured in a video, you ask your question through a website called Quora. So Quora is a knowledge-sharing platform where you can ask any sort of question and have people with relevant expertise or experience or knowledge answer your question. And you can answer a question about, just about anything on there. But of course, if you ask any sort of Tolkien question, when you're done, you're going to be given a list of people to say, hey, here's people that you might want to target your question specifically at. My name is going to be at or near the top of that list. Of course, you could also just follow the link in the description to this video to my Quora page, as well as my Quora group, which is called the Grey Havens. So, yeah, the usual stuff. Like the video, comment on the video, subscribe if you haven't already. We're going to get down to the nitty-gritty because I want to make sure I count them correctly, because I said I had 10 last time and I have 9. So let's see. I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. I have 10 questions for you today. Now, unfortunately, last week when I was recording the video, it didn't dawn on me what number it was when I started. And I had planned to maybe do something. Bless me, huh? I had planned to do maybe something special for 111, 11D1, and at the very least to read Bilbo's speech at his 11th birthday party. And if you don't know, 11D1 or just 11D in general is not a word that Tolkien came up with. A lot of people make that assumption that he came up with the word 11D, and he actually didn't. It comes sort of from a very old way of counting, where, of course, you had your 10s and your 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. And then you had what were called the umpties, which is what we would call 100 through 109, and then the 11ds. And then at 120 was 100. And obviously this changed over time. We don't consider 120 to be, 120 to be 100 anymore. We consider 100 to be 100. And so that sort of went out of favor, and we started saying 110 and such, 111, 11D1, it's not Old English or Middle English. It is Modern English, although it is derived from those. I mean, Edlufonting was the Old English form of 11D. In some older forms of measurement, you can still see 120 units being referred to as a long hundred. And I think that Tolkien was playing around with the idea of measurements, too, and old sort of measurements, because in this scene that I'm about to read, where Bilbo is addressing the party at his 111th birthday party, and also Frodo's 33rd birthday party, he mentions that since he's 111, or 11D1 as he says, and Frodo is turning 33, which is the coming of age for hobbits, that adds up to 144. And while he pretty much invited the whole Shire, and there were probably, many hundreds of people at the actual party, this sort of exclusive area, the pavilion where Bilbo was, he invited specifically 144 people, one for each year of his life and each year of Frodo's life put together. And he used the term one gross, which offended his guests, which I think he knew was going to offend his guests, and I believe that he wanted to put them off a bit, so that maybe they wouldn't be overly concerned when he pulls his little vanishing act with the One Ring. But it's because that's a measurement for things, not for people. And then some people, just sort of bristled at the idea of him using that term and starting to think, and some of them started to think that, well, I was only invited to fill out a certain number, and, especially in the case of like the Sackville Bagginses, that may have actually been the case. So I'm going to read you a bit from the Fellowship of the Ring, the second chapter here. Actually, it's the first chapter, A Long Expected Party. I don't know why I was thinking. The first chapter is quite long. That's probably right. Here we go. Did not take me long to find that. "That is the signal for supper," said Bilbo. The pain and alarm vanished at once, and the prostrate hobbits leaped to their feet. There was a splendid supper for everyone, that is, except those invited to the special family dinner party. This was held in the great pavilion with the tree. The invitations were limited to 12 dozen, a number also called by the hobbits one gross, though the word was not considered proper to use of people. And the guests were selected from all the families to which Bilbo and Frodo were related, with the addition of a few special unrelated friends such as Gandalf. Many young hobbits were included and present by parental permission, for hobbits were easy-going with their children in the matter of sitting up late, especially when there was a chance of getting them a free meal. Bringing up young hobbits took a lot of provender. There were many Bagginses and Boffins, and also many Tooks and Brandybucks. There were various Grubbs, relations of Bilbo Baggins' grandmother, and various Chubbs, connections of his Took grandfather, and a selection of Burrowses, Bolgers, Bracegirdles, Brockhouses, Goodbodies, Hornblowers, and Proudfoots. Some of these were only very distantly connected with Bilbo, and some had hardly ever been in Hobbiton before, as they lived in remote corners of the Shire. The Sackville Bagginses were not forgotten. Otho and his wife Lobelia were present. They disliked Bilbo and detested Frodo, but so magnificent was the invitation card, written in golden ink, that they had felt it was impossible to refuse. Besides, their cousin Bilbo had been specializing in food for many years, and his table had a high reputation. All the 144 guests expected a pleasant feast, though they rather dreaded the after-dinner speech of their host, inevitable item. He was liable to drag in bits of what he called poetry, and sometimes, after a glass or two, would allude to the absurd adventures of his mysterious journey. The guests were not disappointed. They had a very pleasant feast, in fact, an engrossing entertainment, rich, abundant, varied, and prolonged. The purchase of provisions fell almost to nothing throughout the district in the ensuing week, but as Bilbo's catering had depleted the stocks of most of the stores, cellars, and warehouses for miles around, that did not matter much. After the feast, more or less, came the speech. Most of the company were, however, now in a tolerant mood, at that delightful stage which they called filling up the corners. They were sipping their favorite drinks and nibbling at their favorite dainties, and their fears were forgotten. They were prepared to listen to anything and to cheer at every full stop. "My dear people," began Bilbo, rising in his place. "Hear, hear, hear," they shouted, and kept in repeating it in chorus, seeming reluctant to follow their own advice. Bilbo left his place and went and stood on a chair under the illuminated tree. The light of the lanterns fell on his beaming face. The golden buttons shone on his embroidered silk waistcoat. They could all see him standing, waving one hand in the air. The other was in his trouser pocket. "My dear Bagginses and Boffins," he began again. "My dear Tooks and Brandybucks and Grubbs and Chubbs and Burrowses and Hornblowers and Bolgers, Bracegirdles, Goodbodies, Brockhouses, and Proudfoots." "Proud feet," shouted an elderly hobbit from the back of the pavilion. His name, of course, was Proudfoot, and well merited. His feet were large, exceptionally furry, and both were on the table. "Proudfoots," repeated Bilbo. "Oh, so my good Sackville Bagginses, that I welcome back at last to Bag End. Today is my 111th birthday. I'm 11 today." "Hooray, hooray, many happy returns," they shouted, and they hammered joyously on the tables. Bilbo was doing splendidly. This was the sort of stuff they liked, short and obvious. "I hope you are all enjoying yourselves as much as I am." Deafening cheers, cries of yes and no, noises of trumpets and horns, pipes and flutes and other musical instruments. There were, as had been said, many young hobbits present. Hundreds of musical crackers had been pulled. Most of them bore the mark Dale on them, which did not convey much meaning to most of the hobbits, but they all agreed they were marvelous crackers. They contained instruments, small but of perfect make and enchanting tones. Indeed, in one corner, some of the young Tooks and Brandybucks, supposing Uncle Bilbo to have finished, since he had plainly said all that was necessary, now got up an impromptu orchestra, and began a merry dance tune. Master Everard Took and Miss Melilot Brandybuck got on a table, and with bells in their hands began to dance the Springle Ring, a pretty dance, but rather vigorous. But Bilbo had not finished. Seizing a horn from a youngster nearby, he blew 3 loud hoots. The noise subsided. "I shall not keep you long," he cried. Cheers from all the assembly. "I have called you all together for a purpose." Something in the way he said this made an impression. There was almost silence, and one or two of the Tooks pricked up their ears. Indeed, for 3 purposes. First of all, to tell you that I am all immensely fond of you all, and that 11 years is too short a time to live among such excellent and admirable hobbits. Tremendous outburst of approval. I don't know half of you as well as I should like, and I like less than half of you half as well as you deserve. This was unexpected and rather difficult. There was some scattered clapping, but most of them were trying to work it out and see if it came to a compliment. Second, to celebrate my birthday. Cheers again. I should say our birthday, for it is, of course, also the birthday of my heir and nephew Frodo. He comes of age and into his inheritance today, some perfunctory clapping by the elders and some loud shouts of Frodo, Frodo, jolly old Frodo from the juniors. The Sackville Bagginses scowled and wondered what was meant by coming into his inheritance. Together we score 144. Your numbers were chosen to fit this remarkable total. 1 gross, if I may use the expression. No cheers. This was ridiculous. Many of the guests, and especially the Sackville Bagginses, were insulted, feeling sure they had only been asked to fill up the required number like goods in a package. 1 gross indeed. Vulgar expression. It is also, if I may be allowed to refer to ancient history, the anniversary of my arrival by barrel at Esgaroth on the Long Lake, though the fact that it was my birthday slipped my memory on that occasion. I was only 51 then, and birthdays did not seem so important. The banquet was very splendid, however, though I had a bad cold at the time, I remember, and could only say, "Thank you very much." I now repeat it more correctly, "Thank you very much for coming to my little party." Obstinate silence. They all feared that a song or some poetry was now imminent, and they were getting bored. Why couldn't he stop talking and let them drink his health? But Bilbo did not sing or recite. He paused for a moment. "Thirdly and finally," he said, "I wish to make an announcement." He spoke this last word so loudly that suddenly everyone sat up who still could. "I regret to announce that, though, as I said, 11 years is far too short a time to spend among you, this is the end. I am going. I am leaving now. Goodbye." And then, of course, he puts on the 1 ring, and it seems to everyone that he just disappears. There was also a flash of light, which is something that Gandalf did to sort of make it seem like the disappearing was something that he did, and to sort of, take the blame onto himself, because he was already feeling kind of funny about the ring that Bilbo had, and he really didn't think that anyone should know that he had such a thing for various reasons. And so, if it ever came down to it, if people started asking, well, how did he really do that? They say, well, that old wizard Gandalf was there, and there was a loud flash of light. It was probably him. He had magic fireworks, and he's never been any good, that sort of thing. Now, one thing that's really interesting, I really shouldn't have put this away. I meant to read this last week. Like I said, I started recording the video, and it didn't really come to my mind to do this, and I wound up reading from Beowulf, because I wasn't thinking, this is the 111th episode. Now it's 112, 112, as you may say, our 112nd episode. But one interesting thing that I noticed, and I think that we could probably blame, Frodo for this more than anybody, is that, when he makes the speech and he talks about all of the different, surnames, all the relations that are there, they're not in any particular order. I mean, he starts with Bagginses and Boffins, Tooks, Brandybucks, Grubbs, Chubbs, Burrowises, Hornblowers, Bulgers, Bracegirdles, Goodbodies, Brockhouses, and Proudfoots. And then he sticks the Sackville Bagginses at the end. But earlier, in the narrative form, he mentions, the narration mentions Bagginses and Boffins, and then Tooks and Brandybucks, and these are important because these are the ones that are mostly related to them. Various Grubbs and Chubbs, but then the rest is interesting. Burrowses, Bulgers, Bracegirdles, Brockhouses, Goodbodies, Hornblowers, and Proudfoots. Some of these, is it the same order here? Let's see. Bulgers, Bracegirdles, Brockhouses. No, see, he doesn't mention, does he mention Goodbodies? He mentioned Goodbodies. Yeah, the order is different. Because when he speaks it out loud, he says Bulgers, Bracegirdles, Goodbodies, Brockhouses. But when it's listed here, it's Burrowses, Bulgers, Bracegirdles, Brockhouses, Goodbodies, Hornblowers, Proudfoots. What's really interesting is it's in alphabetical order, that little section. Of course, he's already talked about Grubbs, Chubbs, Tooks and all that, but it's just interesting, and I think that, like, when Frodo was writing the narration of the Red Book, he probably had to list it all, and then he just listed it all in alphabetical order, but then remembered the way that Bilbo did it, so, or maybe just kept it different so it's not so, samey, which is probably what Tolkien was going for when he wrote it, Anyway, that's been our reading. It was a lot of fun. I really should have done it last time, but I was excited to show off the copy of Beowulf that Laurel got me and all that, and I had forgotten that it was 111 episodes. But I hope you guys enjoy this episode. 111 is far too short to spend among such admirable YouTubers. I will not say anything about one gross, but let's get to your first question. Our first question comes in by the crest of Wynne Griffiths, who asks, excluding Bilbo, Gandalf, and Gollum, are there any other characters found in both The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings books? Yes, there are several more here. I'm going to divide this into sort of two different sections. The first, I'm going to talk about characters featured, and then I'm going to talk about characters mentioned. The reason is because there is a difference. When featured means that the characters had actually been characters in one book or the other, not necessarily both. And mentioned being characters that were mentioned in both books. I'm only speaking, though, about characters that are alive during at least one of these books. So, no, I'm not going to talk about Bulror or Took or Azog or any others who are just mentioned in both books. So for featured, first we have Elrond. This is probably the biggest one. Elrond was one of only two named elves in The Hobbit and had an even larger role in The Lord of the Rings. And by the way, I did get a comment saying, well, what about Thranduil? He's a named elf. And I was like, he was named in The Lord of the Rings. And I'm going to talk about that in a little bit. He wasn't named in The Hobbit. Then we have Gloin. That's Gimli's father, Gloin. Of course, he was a major character in The Hobbit, in Thorin the Second Oakenshield's party, and then he was there at the Council of Elrond. Then we have Lobelia Sackville Baggins. So I'm counting this as featured. She's definitely a character in The Lord of the Rings. She's kind of a character in The Hobbit. They mention the Sackville Bagginses. They don't mention her specifically by name, but we sort of get a relay of what her and her husband Lotho had said, that they eventually had to admit that the guy who returned claiming to be Bilbo was actually Bilbo. Then we have Gwaihir. Now, Gwaihir is interesting. He's in both books. He's not named Gwaihir in the first book, in The Hobbit. He's just called the Eagle Lord, or the Lord of the Eagles, and we find out that his name is Gwaihir. Some people have said that it's a separate guy, but there's no doubt that Gwaihir is the Lord of the Eagles. I don't think there was a separate Lord of the Eagles, especially since I believe it was in the Nature of Middle-earth. It may have been the Peoples of Middle-earth, but I believe it was in the Nature of Middle-earth where they had stated that Gwaihir has actually been around since the First Age, so it's not like he's a recent addition, and that it is exactly, the same Gwaihir. I believe it was the Nature of Middle-earth, because that's the one where he went back to his original decision that the eagles were in fact angelic creatures. Then we have Dane the Second Ironfoot. He's a character, a minor character in The Hobbit. This is Thorin's cousin. He becomes king under the mountain. He's not really a character in The Lord of the Rings. He's more of a character in The Lord of the Rings appendix. He's mentioned a few times, and he actually dies towards the end of The Lord of the Rings, but he is there. And then finally, this one's stretching it a little bit for featured, but I'm going to say Tom, Bert, and William. These are the three trolls that Bilbo encountered in The Hobbit, and then they were turned to stone by the sun after Gandalf distracted them until the sun came up. They were featured in The Lord of the Rings. They were dead, but they were there. They were stone statues. Merry and Pippin had come across them, and they panicked, saying that they were trolls. And then they came running back, and Aragorn was not really worried about it because it was daytime, and they came and they saw that it was the trolls that Bilbo had run into all those years prior. Then I'm going to say that, these are the characters that are, in one book but only mentioned in the other. So we have Saruman. Now, Saruman is not mentioned by name in The Hobbit, but they do mention the White Wizard, which is Saruman. So they just didn't have a name for him yet. Same thing. Well, sort of the same thing with Radagast. Radagast is actually named in both of them. In some versions of The Hobbit, it depends on like which edition you have. But in some versions, Gandalf calls Radagast his cousin, which is, I guess all of the Ainur are sort of related in a way. And in some, he says, is just another wizard, a member of my order. And then he actually has a scene in The Lord of the Rings. Then there's all the other dwarves, really, except for Fili and Kili, most especially Balin and Ori and, all the rest of them. Most of the dwarves that were in The Hobbit were mentioned, at least at one point or another, in The Lord of the Rings. Fili and Kili weren't, except in, The Tale of Years, probably. But Balin and Ori were both mentioned as being killed in or around Moria, and Balin's tomb is sort of a major set piece in The Lord of the Rings, and some of them are just mentioned briefly, like Bomba. Or of course, I went over Gloin because he's actually in The Lord of the Rings. And then finally, Bard the Bowman and Bjorn, they both were characters in The Hobbit that had, like some of these dwarves, died between the two books, and they're mentioned in The Lord of the Rings. That Bard the Bowman's grandson is King Brand of Dale, and Bjorn's son, Grimbeorn the Old, is the Lord of the Bjornings. So I believe that about sums it up. There are probably others that maybe were mentioned in both, like some of Bilbo's cousins or such, but I think I got them all, So anyway, let's move on to the next question. The next question is coming in by the request of, I hope I'm saying this right, Tali, I think. Tali here asks, we know that Aulë and Yavanna created their own children. Which other Valar do you think may have done the same? I would argue that they all did, but mostly they did it through Ilúvatar. The tale of Aulë and Yavanna is interesting because the dwarves and the Ents are not created in the same fashion. The Ents were created in the correct way. Yavanna sang her wishes during the Ainulindala, and Ilúvatar heard them, and he included them in creation. She either forgot that she did that, or she thought that her wishes had not been heard, but was reminded by Ilúvatar through Manwë that her wishes were heard, and that the trees would have protectors, to sort of alleviate some of the anxiety that she was having about all these different races that were going to go around chopping down her trees, sort of willy-nilly. In other words, the Ents were created by Ilúvatar, but they were Yavanna's idea. He heard the idea, he approved of the idea, and they were included in the blueprint of creation. The dwarves, on the other hand, were sort of done the wrong way. Aulë didn't think of them during the Ainulindala, but rather he became impatient, and he wished to create a people to fill the empty world. And this is not all that different from the thoughts of Melkor, which is likely why Ilúvatar was so concerned and questioned Aulë on his motivations. Why did he create people when he had neither the power nor the authority to do so? Was it his wish to create beings with no will other than his own? That being said, the biggest and the most obvious answer to the question is Melkor himself. He created dragons and orcs and trolls. And though he is not of the Valar, there's also Sauron. He added to the world with werewolves and vampires. Now, none of these were created in the right way, like the Ents, and Ilúvatar certainly didn't approve of them like he did with the dwarves, but through this loophole of necromancy, these are Melkor and Sauron's children. For the rest, we can make assumptions that several creatures were thought of by the Valar or the Maiar, during the Ainulindala, and were included in creation by Ilúvatar. I would say that most sea creatures were probably the thought of Ulmo, though the more destructive ones may be Os's idea. Remember, all of the Ainur sang, not just the Valar. The eagles are an interesting case because originally, and I just alluded to this when I was talking about Gwei here, Tolkien considered them to be incarnated Maiar, and then he changed his mind and said that they were just, birds who could speak, and they were of a higher order, but they were still just birds. I mean, we may have said, okay, at this point they might be Manwë's children, but later in life, he changed his mind again, and he reverted back to the original idea that they were Maiar. But birds in general, not just the great eagles, they might be Manwë's children. You could think of any form of life that isn't, the elves or the men or the offshoots of men like, hobbits and giants, and you could tentatively in your mind match them to this guy or that guy in the Valar, So, like I said, Tolkien doesn't break it down like that and list, okay, well, Ulmo came up with turtles and stuff like that. But we can make a lot of assumptions that probably he got all of the, Ilúvatar got all the ideas for all the different creatures from the individual voices singing the Song of Creation. All right, let's move on to the next question. Our next question comes in by the request of Paul, who asks, what are Valian Years, and how does time pass differently for mortals who go to the Undying Lands? So, really two questions here, but they're sort of related. Valian Years were a measurement of time that were used before the sun and the moon were created. When the Ainur, that's the angels, when they first came down to Arda, that's the earth, and they started shaping it, they didn't bother to count time. Time was sort of a new concept to them anyway. This time was known as the Spring of Arda, and Middle-earth was in a constant daytime, lit by these two great lamps. After the lamps were cast down by Melkor, this was the first darkness. When the angels left Middle-earth and went to the Undying Lands, the two trees were created, and this is when they started what we know as the count of time, meaning that they now started actually keeping track of the days and the years. And they used the two trees to count time. When Laurelin the gold waxed, it was daytime, and when Telperion the silver waxed, it was nighttime. 1 cycle was a Valian day, and 1,000 cycles is a Valian year. When the trees were destroyed, the sun and the moon were created, and the days and nights became shorter. This was advantageous, as the sun, at least it lit up the whole world, not just the Undying Lands, and Middle-earth was no longer in constant darkness, though at least, Varda created extra stars for the elves to see by. Tolkien actually varied, because he changed his mind a lot, on how long a Valian year actually is. The most common thought is it's roughly around 9.5 years, solar years, and that's a Valian year, though he also experimented with the idea of the Valian years actually being a lot longer than that. As for the passage of time, for mortals in the Undying Lands, time doesn't pass quicker or slower for them. However, their perception of the passage of time would be skewed. We see a practical example of this in The Lord of the Rings, in the one place in Middle-earth that is like the Undying Lands, that's Lothlorien. So out of all the bearers of the three rings, only, 2 of them had ever been to the Undying Lands, Galadriel and Gandalf. And Gandalf never set up a realm. He didn't even really stay in one place for too long. But Galadriel, unlike, Gil-galad or Círdan or Elrond, she knew what the Undying Lands were like because she lived there. And she used her ring to make a place in Middle-earth that was like the Undying Lands. So when the Fellowship had been out of Lothlorien for a bit, there's a line where Sam notices the moon, and he sort of looks at it funny, but he doesn't say anything yet. And then later on, he looks at the moon again, and he voices his concern. Either he lost track of time in Lothlorien, or there was some real tomfoolery going on with the moon. And Aragorn told him it's the former. They had spent nearly a full month in Lothlorien, though Sam could only remember a few days, and he seemed to remember more, but he was unclear on how much time passed for him. This is what it's like for mortals in places like Valinor. Time slips forward, and you just barely notice it because everything around you is unchanging. And as time really is a measurement of change, if you were in a place where nothing changed, generally speaking, like in Valinor, or in a place where it changes very little, like in Lothlorien, because there are seasons in Lothlorien, and those seasons are very different. Legolas goes through a whole explanation of that. A week might seem like a day. And that's how the elves live. They're immortal, and this is why mortals would feel like their life went by faster in such a place, but it doesn't actually go by faster. All right, let's move on to the next question. Our next question comes in from the Oski Boski, who asks, why was Sauron not present in a fight against Ungoliant? Did Morgoth not call him for aid? So, Morgoth didn't call anyone specific for aid. He just screamed, really, really loud. To explain how loud Morgoth's scream was, I made this little map that I'm going to put right here. The red circle there that you see, it shows the smallest possible area that could have heard Morgoth's scream. Now, I made this having Lameth, which is the place where Ungoliant attacked, and it was named afterwards, as Morgoth's scream created a persistent echo there, hence the name Lameth, which means great echo, or depending on how you translate it, it could be terrible echo. If the red circle doesn't really seem so large to you, take a look at the northwestern area, and to the east of the red circle, you'll notice a range of mountains going north to south, the eastern borders of Beleriand. Beleriand is the setting of the Silmarillion. Morgoth's scream was heard in at least half of it. I say at least because I put the edge of the circle at Angband, but it's very possible, and I would say probable, that the area was actually far larger than this. The Balrogs had to have heard him, and they were not, hanging around outside of Angband playing b-ball in the courtyard. They were deep underground. So it stands to reason that this shockwave, because any sound this loud is indeed a shockwave, and Tolkien described it as rending mountains, it had to be felt or heard far underneath the ground, so the area of effect was probably a lot bigger than the circle that I made. So why am I going into all this? To point out that Morgoth wasn't calling anyone in particular for help. He was screaming. So why didn't Sauron come? And there's a variety of reasons that I can get into, but none of them would really matter. What matters is that it is exceedingly likely that Balrogs were probably the only servants that he had that could get there fast enough. For all we know, Sauron could have, been elsewhere, but also for all we know, he could have been the one that heard the scream and turned to the Balrogs and said, "Go." Balrogs are just a lot faster than Sauron is, so that's why they were the ones who actually came to his aid. All right, let's move on to the next question. Our next question comes in by the request of Enyo Does the Thinking, who asks, what do you think of the theory that Gollum actually got to the Shire before being drawn to Mordor, and that he was the one who drowned Frodo's parents? I think it fits his character, and they died under kind of mysterious circumstances. So, this is one of those situations where I sort of have to try my best to be nice about it, but it's very hard. It's bunk. I'm not usually so forceful when it comes to fan theories, but this is really just bovine excrement, and it deserves absolutely no regard. This theory has been around for a long time, and I don't understand why it's still around. The idea that Gollum got into the Shire and drowned Drogo and Primula is this sort of, I think, edgelord garbage that George R.R. Martin would have written if he was the one telling the story. It's just also not true. We were told directly that Gollum tried to get to the Shire and then turned southward and wound up in Mordor. And this was due to the fact that Sauron had taken up his throne in Barad-dûr after being driven out of Mirkwood and declared himself openly and sent out a call for all manner of evil creatures to join him. Gollum wasn't an orc or a troll, but he was certainly wicked. So he was compelled to travel to Mordor. And this really shows you how great Sauron's magic is. He was able to overpower Gollum's desire to regain his precious and take revenge on Bilbo. So that's like really the first of three reasons I'm going to give you as to why this is bunk. The first being we're told directly that that's not what happened. The second is Gollum's target would be Bilbo in Hobbiton in the West Farthing, while Drogo and Primula, they lived in Buckland, which is east of the East Farthing. Gollum would have probably had to go through Buckland to get to Hobbiton, but he would have no reason to attack Drogo and Primula. Even if they were Bagginses, he knows what Bilbo looks like. He's not going to make a silly mistake like that, nor would he casually just murder a couple and stir up trouble before getting to his main target. The third and the biggest reason why this theory should have been put to rest very shortly after it was first raised, and this was well before I was born even, is that the timeline doesn't match up. So I'm going to read you a little bit of Appendix B of The Lord of the Rings, and here it says, in the year 2951, Sauron himself declares himself openly and gathers power in Mordor. He begins the rebuilding of Barad-dûr. Gollum turns set towards Mordor. Sauron sends 3 of the Nazgûl to reoccupy Dol Guldur. Elrond reveals to Estel his true name and ancestry, and delivers to him the shards of Narsil. Arwen, newly returned from Lorien, meets Aragorn in the woods of Imladris. Aragorn goes out into the wild. Those are all the major events that happened in that specific year. So the year that Gollum turned southwards towards Mordor before reaching the Shire was 2951 of the Third Age. And you know what's interesting about that? Drogo and Primula died 29 years later, in 2980 of the Third Age. So, and then Frodo was a little 2-year-old hobbit. So, before any nonsense about, well, maybe he came back. No, he didn't. We know exactly what happened to him. Gollum did not reach Mordor quickly. In fact, he reached Mordor the very same year that Drogo and Primula died. It took him 29 years to get to Mordor. So remember, I said Frodo's parents died in 2980. I'm going to read you the entry from that year from Appendix B. Aragorn enters Lorien and there meets again Arwen and Domiel. Aragorn gives her the ring of Barahir, and they plight their troth upon the hill of Caern Amroth. About that time, Gollum reaches the confines of Mordor and becomes acquainted with Shelob. Theoden becomes king of Rohan, birth of Samwise. So we also know that Gollum did not meet with Shelob and then just jet back up to the Shire to kill Frodo's parents, and then somehow make it back to Mordor to get captured and brought before Sauron. I mean, it took him 29 years to reach Mordor the first time. The only time, well, not the only time, because he went there with Frodo and Sam. He doesn't leave Mordor even until the year 3017, which is 37 years after Frodo's parents had already died, and he was then captured by Aragorn around the Dead Marshes and brought to Mirkwood. From there, we know that he eventually escaped, and he wound up, in Moria until he started following the Fellowship. Gollum never stepped foot in the Shire, and he was in Mordor when Frodo's parents died. I think that this would have been cleared up by Appendix B in the 1950s when the books were published, but the fact that we've had to endure decades of this theory just really proves that people really want to turn the Lord of the Rings into something that it really isn't, Like I said, I'm sorry if I was forceful on this one, but this one really bugs me out of all the weird fan theories that are out there, and there are a lot of them. I did a series about the Middle-earth or Tolkien iceberg, which was a lot of fun, and there were some weird fan theories in there. But yeah, this is the one that I like the least. This is my least favorite fan theory. Let's move on to the next question. Our next question comes in from Lucas, who asks, where did the boat in Gollum's cave come from? Did Gollum find it? Did he build it? Where would he get the materials? I think this is a good question. There are a lot of different possible explanations as to where the boat came from, and, none of them are explicitly stated by Tolkien. Keep in mind that while Tolkien had at this point been writing about Middle-earth for more than a decade, The Hobbit was initially not connected to Middle-earth, and Gollum was not supposed to be a hobbit. Gollum's backstory was added later in The Lord of the Rings, and the author even revised the text of The Hobbit concerning Gollum to create better continuity. At this point, he's just a creature that lives under the mountain. So where did he get the boat? There are a lot of explanations, but I managed to boil them all down into just 3 possibilities. So the first is the boat could have just already been there, and Gollum just started using it. Could have been made by goblins at some point and then was abandoned. The second possible idea is that Gollum made the boat. He came from a river-dwelling people, and he may have known how to make a rudimentary boat. In a lot of the artistic depictions, he's usually shown in something like a rowboat or a small canoe, but it also could have been a rudimentary raft that Bilbo just called a boat. It was very dark, and he was under a lot of stress, and, he calls Gandalf's staff a wand anyway. Using the ring, he could have stolen the materials from the goblins under the mountain. And the third possibility is that Gollum stole the boat and then brought it with him. He was not above stealing, as it was said in The Lord of the Rings, that the reason that he was kicked out of his community was that he used the ring for mischief, to hear secrets and to steal things. We aren't told by what route he enters the mountains. It could have been via a stream. So at this point, I would say it's up to any reader to decide which of these is the truth. I would say that the one that I go with is the second possibility, that he probably made the boat. It seems to me the most true. It was a little boat. He was described as paddling along with his feet dangling in the water. I don't think it would have been big enough for goblins to use, unless it was just used by one very small goblin. But I also don't see why they would make a boat like that. I think that the boats that the river stores used were probably bigger, to hold more than one person. So I don't think he brought it with him. I think he made it, and he made it for himself. He's a selfish guy. He only needs a boat big enough for himself. I think that's what happened. I think he just stole the materials from the goblins, and some people brought up that he could have made it from goblin remains, like bones and skins and stuff, it's a grisly thought, but Gollum's kind of a grisly guy, so there you have it. All right, let's move on to the next question. Our next question comes in by the request of Trevor Merca, who asks, who spent more time in Beleriand and Middle-earth, Círdan, Treebeard, or Durin's Bane? And we can sit and argue about birth dates and such, but I think in the end, no matter how you figure it, the answer is going to be Treebeard. Treebeard is very old, and as he speaks plainly in the Two Towers of events of the First Age, making reference to Beleriand. Now, we don't know whether Treebeard was one of the very first Ents to awaken or not. He is said to be the oldest remaining of a race that seems longevous, functionally immortal. It is possible that there may have been older Ents that existed and then died. Either their lives do have an eventual end, or they were killed somehow. Círdan is equally hard to nail down. We're never given a birth date for Círdan. But we know he's the oldest known elf still kicking around in Middle-earth in the Third Age. Some theorize that he may have been a first-generation elf, one of the original 144, though I personally find that unlikely from Tolkien's writings. Tolkien wrote in his very last writings about Círdan that he was a kinsman of Elwë and Olwë. So Elwë, he's usually also known as Eleuthingel. Eleuthingel is not a first-generation elf, nor is Círdan said to necessarily be older than Thingol. We know that there are an unknown number of generations between Thingol and Enel, who was the third elf to ever awaken. It seems likely to me that Círdan is from the same generation of elves that gave us Thingol. This would still make him likely older than Treebeard, even if Treebeard was one of the very first Ents. The words of Ilúvatar, relayed to Yavanna by Manwë, stated that the Ents would arise when the second-born were young, meaning after the awakening of mortal men. Now, if we have established that Círdan is almost certainly older than Treebeard, but yet I state that Treebeard is the correct answer to the question, you're likely wondering why I have said such a thing. And, at this point, people on Quora are probably already writing a comment, But before I get to that, let's talk about Durin's Bane. Durin's Bane, he's of course a Balrog, and as such he's one of the Ainur. This would make him older than not only Círdan, but any elf. He's older than Middle-earth. He's older than the universe itself. It's also likely that the Balrogs all stayed in Middle-earth with Melkor rather than departing to the Undying Lands like Sauron did and then returning. Sauron did that to spy on the Valar. The Balrogs were not spies. That being said, now you must really wonder, how could I say the answer is Treebeard? And the answer is actually rather simple. The question didn't ask who was first or who was the oldest. The question asked who was in Middle-earth the longest. Now, I'm not counting ghosts here, of exiled or forcefully discarnated Maiar, the likes of which Sauron and Saruman were certainly at the end of The Lord of the Rings, and this was almost certainly the same fate that Durin's Bane had. But let's say that a bodily death from which the character cannot return, either as an incarnate or with a fauna, or constructed form, let's call that the end of their time in Middle-earth. Thus, Durin's Bane dies, while Círdan and Treebeard live on, and Círdan, at some point, will depart from Middle-earth, along with Celeborn, and some people also believe Thranduil, and this happens at some point in the Fourth Age. Now, Treebeard, however, barring any unfortunate incidents that may kill him, seems to have no desire to leave Middle-earth, and he will persist. Eventually, he will have been alive in Middle-earth for a longer period than Círdan and Durin's Bane. To illustrate this point, I'm going to give you the words spoken between Treebeard and Galadriel and Celeborn. I'm going to read you a little bit of The Return of the King. Then Treebeard said farewell to each of them in turn, and he bowed 3 times slowly and with great reverence to Celeborn and Galadriel. It is long, long since we met by the stock or by stone. Avanamar, vanamulion nostari, he said. It is sad that we should meet only thus at the ending, for the world is changing. I feel it in the water, I feel it in the earth, and I smell it in the air. I do not think we shall meet again. And Celeborn said, I do not know, eldest. But Galadriel said, not in Middle-earth. Not until the lands that lie under the wave are lifted up again. Then in the willow meads of Tasranan may we meet again in the spring. Farewell. So Galadriel, she's going to be departing Middle-earth, and eventually so too will Celeborn, and she does state that they will not meet again in Middle-earth, at least until Beleriand is restored, and then they may meet in Tasranan. So Tasranan is also called Nantathran. It's not a very important place in the story of the Silmarillion, but the name comes up, here and there, but based on Galadriel's choice of Tasranan, it may be important to the Ents, and perhaps it may even be, where they first came from. And this tells me that Treebeard will be in Middle-earth through to the end of the current iteration of the Earth and beyond to its revival. Of course, the actual answer would be Tom Bombadil, but he wasn't included. All right, let's move on to the next question. Our next question comes in by the request of Quinton Stevens, who asks, did Saruman's ring survive the destruction of the One? To be honest with you, I'm not sure that its powers even lasted that long. If there were indeed any significant powers to this ring. Saruman had a ring on his finger when he spoke to Gandalf in the chapter The Council of Elrond, and he proclaimed himself Saruman Ring-bearer and Saruman of many colors. Now, I doubt greatly at this point that we could consider this a ring of power. Firstly, all of the rings of power are more or less accounted for. Gandalf has one, Galadriel has one, Elrond has one, Sauron has the rest. Though the Nazgul may or may not be carrying them. I've talked about that, carrying some of theirs. It is, of course, it's not the one ring which Frodo has. I would consider it to be what Gandalf earlier referred to as a lesser ring. This is partly because of the fact that Saruman calls himself Ringmaker, which states that he made it himself. Now let's get something out of the way. Anyone can make a ring if they know, some basics. Making a magic ring is another matter, but not beyond the realm of possibility for a wizard such as Saruman, who studied magic craft under the Valar Aulë. There are then 2 possibilities here. One is that Saruman made the ring with his own knowledge in magic, whatever its powers may have been, such as making his robe shift colors. And then his powers of the ring would have perished when his magic abilities were removed by Gandalf. Saruman then only had the skill that was inherent to him, his voice and his charisma. I have to drink water. But he lost, the great deal of his angelic powers that he had. The other possibility is that Sauron taught him how to make the ring, which is possible, but I'm going to say improbable. That would, make whatever meager powers the ring possessed also peter out when the One Ring was destroyed. But I'm of the former thought that the ring's magic was fueled by Saruman himself, and that this power was revoked from him, and then whatever it did, it stopped doing. As a matter of fact, when in the chapter, in The Return of the King, when they're journeying north through Dunland towards, Rivendell, and they run into Saruman and Grima, they didn't mention anything about his robe shifting color, so there is that as well. All right, let's move on to the next question. Our next question comes in by the request of Kyle Tallerty, who asks, can you explain the eschatology in Tolkien's Legendarium? So if anyone doesn't know, eschatology is usually a religious phrase meaning how the world ends. We don't really know, because this is one of the things that Tolkien would change his mind on a great many times, and I can tell you a bit about what he did say, and you can decide for yourself what is canon, which is, I think, a dubious concept at best. In universe, the beliefs of the elves, as well as the history of the elves, and their opinions of creation, were written down by various lore masters throughout the years, and kept in various collections of lore. The most important to us is the collection of lore found in Imladris, also known as Rivendell, which was translated into the common speech in the late Third Age by Mr. Bilbo Baggins, Esquire. These translations from Elvish lore were imperfect and incomplete, but added to the Red Book along with Bilbo's own memoir, as well as those of his cousin Frodo and friends. We came to know this text as the Silmarillion. The Silmarillion is not the only text, however, that deals with the creation myth and history found in Middle-earth as similar. The differently written accounts were made by mortal men in Numenor and later Gondor. These texts became known to us as the Book of Lost Tales. These texts are more complete and far more detailed, though are said to be incorrect on a lot of things, such as erroneously referring to the Valar as gods, and exaggerations of the number of Balrogs that existed, and impossible feats of strength attributed to mortals, such as Tur slaying 5 Balrogs. Out of universe, both of these texts are alternate takes on the same story, but at different stages of evolution in Tolkien's mind. The Book of Lost Tales is an earlier and more primitive, though more detailed and complete version of the Silmarillion. He revised the text a great many times and did not finish it before he died. Thus, the version of the Silmarillion that is in print is incomplete, it's imperfect, and it's not the entire story as Tolkien envisioned it. Some of his intended changes made it into the final published version, and some were ideas that he had but did not write, found in other publications. That is to say, not all of Tolkien's ideas are in the Silmarillion. We generally consider the Silmarillion true, as in the events in it happened as written, though there are minor issues that we can attribute, in universe to Bilbo. For example, Gil-galad is said to be Fingon's son in the Silmarillion, and he's not. And out of universe, we could explain this as the fact that Christopher Tolkien made some errors or some lapses in judgment when editing the work, and he explained that in later publications. Anyway, all this to say, Tolkien once had an idea of the eschatology of the world of Arda, but it is not contained in the Silmarillion. Only there are widowed and orphaned references that remain throughout. We get a lot of references to the final battle throughout the Silmarillion. Tolkien once intended to end the book with the second prophecy of Mandos, which is about the end of Arda. There were various drafts of it, but they mostly share a common thread, that Melkor will somehow return from the void and trigger the final battle known as the Dagor Dagoroth, which literally means the Battle of Battles. Melkor will first battle Eärendil in the sky, and then he'll be cast down to earth, and then he'll battle Tokus and Eanwa and Turin, who is returned from the doom of man for the final battle, and it will be Turin that gives the final blow, destroying Melkor for good. What happens after this is up for debate, as Tolkien kept changing his mind. Early versions had Turin becoming one of the Valar, though he put a large X across that in his notes, so we can say that he rejected that bit. Another common thread is that the world will end and be reborn, as Melkor's essence was so tied up in the world that he could not be destroyed without destroying the world. The world would then be reincarnated in a new Ainu Lindala without the voice of Melkor, though the voices of the children of Iluvatar will be heard by Iluvatar. The idea that the world may be reborn is even referenced in The Lord of the Rings, as we mentioned earlier, Galadriel's final words to Treebeard. Although, like I said, that could be just something that Galadriel believes will happen. It doesn't mean that it necessarily will happen. Another thread tends to be the reunification of the Silmarilli. The ones that are in the earth and the sea will be found and will be rejoined with the one in the sky, and then they will either be broken open by Feanor or surrendered by him to the Valar to be broken, and then the two trees will be reborn. This is at odds, I think, with the world ending, though, or perhaps it happens first and that signals the beginning of the end, but the text always seems to suggest that this happens after Melkor's final demise. This prophecy was not included in the Silmarillion due to a note found by Christopher Tolkien where his father stated that no such prophecy regarding the end of the world was known to the Valar. So Christopher Tolkien saw this as his father abandoning the idea and did not include it. There are a few orphaned references to the final battle, though it seems that Tolkien even tried to at one point pivot to meaning that this final battle was not the final battle to end the world, but the final battle to end the Elder Days, which would be the War of Wrath. In this version, the prophecy was attributed to a mortal woman named Andreth rather than Mandos. The being that Durin was to slay was changed from Melkor, who was defeated by Ainowo and not destroyed but cast out of the world, to Ancalagon the Black. However, we can either assume that this prophecy was not meant to be included either, or that it was made, but it was a false prophecy, as every text that was written regarding the War of Wrath had Eärendil slaying the dragon. I go with the idea that Andreth did make the prophecy, but she was wrong. The wise women of the House of Haelith kind of have a history of being wrong about things, as we see in the debate between Adonal and Finrod. There are other ideas about the end of the world, such as the return of Pharazôn from the deeps of the earth to take part in a battle against Melkor, but we can chalk these up to things that the elves believe, but they might not be true. Tolkien had the idea that even the Silmarillion might just be a story after all. It's the elves' religion, but it didn't really happen that way. And the actual world is very different from the way that the elves see it. In this proposed idea, the world was always round. There was no Akalabeth. The sun and the moon were created alongside the earth, and they've always been there. The two trees of Valinor never existed, and Melkor's fortress was on the moon. In some ways, it kind of takes a lot of the magic out of things, and then you get to that, this fortress is on the moon thing, and that's pretty wild. But he never got past just writing a very, very rough outline of these ideas, so, any such idea about a final battle may have just been, elvish beliefs that were not necessarily true. And I just want to highlight one comment that I got from a Dave Owens who said, "And such is the nature of lore." It's true. Let's move on to the last question. Our final question comes in from Hamid Arauj, who asks, how were the elves able to build their castles and realms? Did they use magic of some sort? So, I gotta say, one's mind need not boggle about how elves build things. Generally speaking, they are human, in the sense that the chief difference physiologically between elves and men is their immortality, which is not even a physiological difference, it's a spiritual difference. They are the same as us, they just live forever. I find the wording of the question to be confusing for me. If I'm being honest, it's fair to ask if the elves use magic to build their structures and their cities, and they do, and I'll talk about that in a little bit, but it's strange to wonder how could they possibly build anything. Elves tend to bristle at the term magic, as they don't understand why we use the same term for things that they do, and we also use that term for the deceits of the enemy. They would probably prefer the word skill over magic. There are a lot of examples in The Lord of the Rings when the Fellowship comes to Lothlorien. Sam wants to see elf magic, which confuses Galadriel. And a bit after that, Pippin asks if the cloaks that they are given are magic. And one of the elves, is an unnamed elf, is quite puzzled at this question. And he just tells Pippin that he's unsure what that means, but they're very good cloaks. They're very well made. And then he goes on to talk about how they're perfect camouflage and how they change colors based on their surroundings. They are magic, but the elves just don't like that word. That being said, the question seems to presuppose that elves cannot build anything without magic. Like, how could they possibly build buildings and cities and realms? They must have used magic, which is, well, let's just say Gandalf would probably call you some mean names, and then he would calm down later and apologize. Elves are perfectly capable of carpentry, and they will build things. They'll build cities, they'll build realms, the same way that men do, or that dwarves do, or that hobbits do. And in fact, due to them being elves, they're probably better at it, since they can have hundreds or thousands of years of experience in building. Now, sometimes they get help from dwarves, especially when they have to build an underground place, such as Thranduil's underground realm, or Nargothrond in the first stage, where, the dwarves helped out. But the answer is still yes, they use magic, even if they would prefer you don't use the M word with the hard C. In Eldamar, we're told that when the elves wished to build a city upon a hill, they just made a hill. They raised the hill, later called Tuna. And by the way, a great knowledge check here is you might be heading to the comments section to correct me. And this is just a little mini rant that I'm going to give. And you say, wait a minute, the Valar raised it. You can, actually, it was the Valar that raised the hill. I read it on the wiki. Despite, this. I'm going to read a paragraph from the Silmarillion. To these the Valar had given a land and a dwelling place. Even among the radiant flowers of the tree-lit gardens of Valinor, they longed still at times to see the stars, and therefore a gap was made in the great walls of the Pelori. And there, in a deep valley that ran down to the seas, the Eldar raised a high green hill. Tuna, it was called. Now, if I had to be the guy that edited all the problems on all the Tolkien wikis out there, I probably wouldn't have time for much else than that. Anyway, rant over. The elves raised a hill up, and that isn't such a normal thing that people do just instantly like that. I guess you can make a hill with shovels and dirt and wheelbarrows and a lot of time, and the elves have nothing but time. But the suggestion of the word raise suggests something akin to Ose raising Numenor from the seabed. Doriath had a magic girdle around it, and the realms of Imladris and Lothlorien were protected by magic. And yes, the magic of the Rings of Power, but also the magic of Elrond and Galadriel, who tended to their realms in the years that they could not use the rings. So yes, elves absolutely can and do use magic to build and maintain their realms, but there's no reason to think that they have to do it that way. They could do it the normal, ordinary, slow way too. They might even enjoy it. Although I think that it's just like straight, because the way that it would work is they would say, okay, I want you to build this house with no magic. And if, okay, I'm not going to use magic. And then they would do something that would very clearly be magic. And you would say, what are you doing? I told you not to use magic. And I'm not using magic. I'm just hammering nails. And that doesn't work like that, because they're probably doing something crazy, like just tapping it with the hammer and then the nail just goes straight in on its own. And they say, and they'll say, well, you're using a magic hammer. And they would say, no, this is just a very good hammer. I made it 1,000 years ago after a lot of years of study, and my grandfather taught it to me, and he taught me how to make it. It's a very good hammer. That's the way that it would happen. There was another answer. Somebody else answered this question where they said the elves don't use magic. Elves are magic. They would probably really hate to hear that. They would be so angry if you said that. But it's true. It's true. I forget who said that. Actually, I should give credit to the person that said that. Let's see. Who said elves are magic? Oh, that was Avery. Avery Goodman. He's one of my fellows in the Nine. So, yeah. He said they are magic. And an elf would get just so aggravated at hearing that. We're not... why'd you use that word? But it's true. Some people just don't want to hear the truth. Because it really is a matter of perspective. Any sort of skill or technology or device that is beyond our simple understanding seems like magic to us. If I was to go back to the 13th century and show a person from the 13th century my smartphone, which just got an alert, they would think magic box. Right? And I would say, well, no, it's not a magic box. And I would have to, I'd try to explain it, and it would be like, they'd be nodding, and like, that's what I said, magic box. So there you have it. A lot of fun today. I'm getting such a headache right now, though. I'm going to go to bed soon. I'm going to take some medication for my headache, and I'm going to go to bed. I loved doing your questions, even the ones that, I may have seemed a little bit irritated at. I try my best to have fun with them anyway. Send me some questions. If you got to the end of the video and you haven't liked it or commented on it, please do so. If you're not subscribed yet, but you've gone through like just about a whole hour of me talking about Tolkien, definitely hit the subscribe and the bell and all that stuff. And consider membership if you want to see all the videos at least a week early, sometimes more than a week early. Or if you just want to support me in a better way, because it really does help me out, consider membership. There's a link in the description if the join button for some reason doesn't work, because sometimes YouTube is just broken. We'll see you guys next time.